This hearing will come to order. This morning, the committee continues our extensive oversight of the Obama administration's nuclear agreement with Iran and its consequences for the national security of the United States, the consequences also for our allies. As many know here, I feel those consequences are quite dire. January 16th was Implementation Day, and that marked an historic turning point in the Middle East because in a snap, Iran's record was cleared, its pariah status was dropped, and this reconnected Iran to the international trade and financial system. Now, with access to $100 billion in unfrozen assets and sanctions wiped away, Iran has instantly become the dominant country in the region. The regime has achieved this all without having to end its aggression against its neighbors. It still calls for the overthrow of the governments in Bahrain and in Saudi Arabia and other regional states. It's done it without swearing off on its support for terrorism. And the Iranian economy was, frankly, prior to this, hemorrhaging. Hemorrhaging because the sanctions which we had pushed had worked. The sanctions we pushed in 2010 and 2012 had led by 2013 to the implosion of the economy there. Now Iran's leaders are predicting swift growth. And they're probably right, because we see these European countries that have observed that the sanctions dam is broken, and they are sprinting into the Iranian market to cut billions in deals and to invest there, and they're making a mockery of the administration's claim that sanctions could snap back if Iran cheats. You tell me if these companies are going to turn back when Iran stiffs international inspectors. The Revolutionary Guards, already Iran's most powerful economic actor. Now, those are the words of our Treasury Department. The most powerful economic actor. Why would that be the Iranian Guards? Because they're the ones that nationalized the construction firms and the companies. So they're only going to grow more powerful with this additional international investment. Just hours after the agreement's implementation, the regime disqualified 2,967 of roughly 3,000 moderate candidates from running in the parliamentary elections later this month. And after the administration finally responded to Iran's missile tests with very minor sanctions, very de minimis sanctions, Iran's moderate president, as he's called, ordered the military to accelerate its intercontinental ballistic missile program. That's aimed here at the United States, and it's designed to carry a nuclear payload, that ICBM program that they're running, where the Ayatollah says it's every military man's mission to help mass produce, and duty to help mass produce ICBMs. Now, worse, the administration continues to go out of its way to appease the Iranian regime, and even thanked Iran after it recently seized 10 U.S. sailors in a highly provocative act, if you ask me. I mean, when was the last time we've seen U.S. sailors taken off their ships with their hands behind their heads, guns trained on them, their ships stripped, photographs for propaganda purposes taken, photographs of one of these sailors crying appearing in the Iranian press, and then medals given to those Iranian agents who took them into custody. It appears the administration is determined to protect this deal at all costs. And just look at how the Obama administration backed away from a new bipartisan U.S. law ending visa waiver travel for those who've traveled to Iran, Iraq, Syria, after an outcry after an outcry from the Iranian regime. And the administration has now decided to basically ignore the law and Iran's ongoing sponsorship of terrorism by stretching a narrow national security waiver far beyond reason. President Obama signed this bill into law, but has essentially allowed Iran's supreme leader to veto it. And in an unusual move, the State Department settled a decades-old financial settlement the day after implementation day, sending the Iranian regime a check for $1.7 billion. As you know, Mr. Ambassador, the committee eagerly awaits answers from the State Department to the many questions surrounding that surprise payment. The administration had countless opportunities to seek committee input to this matter in advance, but purposefully did not do so. That's the conclusion I have to reach. Iran has never complied with any of its past nuclear-related agreements. We're watching this to see if this time it will be different. But even if Iran meets all the administration's expectations, in a few short years, the accord will leave it the dominant power in the Middle East and only steps away from the capability to produce nuclear weapons on an industrial scale. All the while, and this is the most vexing part to me, all the while, Iran's leaders continue on Friday to chant death to America. And many of us are struggling to see how this tilt toward Iran makes us safer. I now recognize the ranking member for any opening comments he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again for calling this hearing. Ambassador Mull, welcome to the Foreign Affairs Committee. Mr. Smith, I know, Ambassador, your current role is the latest stop on a distinguished career as an American diplomat. And no matter whether we supported the Iran deal or opposed it, we're fortunate to have you as our point person on implementation, and we're grateful for your service. Mr. Smith, welcome to you. Thank you for your service. Your office has led the way in cracking down on some of Iran's worst offenses. In my view, Treasury could be doing even more if we had an Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. But the nomination of Adam Zubin is bogged down in the Senate Banking Committee, despite the urgent need to cut off Iran, ISIS, North Korea, and others from their resources. The Senate should confirm Mr. Zubin immediately. This is far from the first time the Foreign Affairs Committee has held a hearing on Iran. We've held many hearings. We understand exactly what the deal was and is, but today's hearing is distinctly different from any we've had before because the Iran deal has been implemented, nuclear-related sanctions have been lifted, and Iran no longer has enough fuel to make a nuclear weapon. Again, no matter what anyone's position was on the Iran deal, and I strongly oppose the Iran deal, this ship has left port, and now we need to decide which course to chart. One option would be to continue bringing up legislation designed to undermine the deal. The House has passed 2 bills like this already, largely along party lines. These are symbolic votes. They'll never become law. In my view, they're not a valuable use of this committee or Congress's time. So I don't think we should treat the Iran deal the way we've dealt with the Affordable Care Act, voting again and again to repeal it, even though it's a settled issue. Again, I didn't like it. I voted against it, but it passed, so there's another option. And the other option, the one I support, is to work in a bipartisan manner to hold Iran's feet to the fire and ensure there are serious consequences for its nefarious behavior. There's a lot we can and should be doing, and I'm confident that we can work across the aisle to find common ground that we can build on. Iran remains the world's most active state sponsor of terror and a chronic human rights abuser. Iran continues to break international law with impunity. We don't trust Iran, and our policies must reflect that. That's why I'm glad we slapped new sanctions on Iran for testing 2 medium-range ballistic missiles late last year, tests that were a blatant violation of the UN Security Council resolution governing the nuclear deal. And there are other problems we need to address. And Iran, freed from most sanctions, can spread more resources to bad actors throughout the region, strengthening the murderous Assad regime, reinforcing Hezbollah, boosting the Houthis in Yemen, and supporting Shia militias in Iraq. As the Chairman pointed out, it really is galling that after we sign an agreement with Iran, their leaders continue to yell death to America. It really is galling. But we need to work together on new legislation that will crack down on this other dangerous behavior of Iran and shore up our allies and partners in the region. So, Ambassador Mull and Mr. Smith, I look forward to hearing from you about the implementation of the JCPOA, the monitoring and verification that Iran is living up to its commitments, and what else we can be doing with respect to Iran outside the scope of the nuclear deal to help make our country safer and enhance stability in the region. Iran had sanctions lifted because of the nuclear agreement, but there are a lot of things that Iran has not yet done, and a lot of bad things that Iran is doing that I think will warrant additional sanctions. For instance, Iran's continued support for terrorism. It's not something we can turn a blind eye to, and we shouldn't. So we need to figure out the way we can be most effective, what we can do in respect to Iran, again, outside the scope of the nuclear deal, because during the nuclear deal, we were told, well, we can't really talk about anything else. We can only talk about the nuclear deal. And so, again, it is galling when we look at Iran. It is, I think, the frustration that you heard from the Chairman is, frankly, the frustration that all of us have with the Iranians and with their bad behavior and with their not changing at all after they sign an agreement, showing no good faith whatsoever, poking us in the eye, continuing to walk on the line and walk over on the wrong way. We really must hold their feet to the fire. So I look forward to your testimony, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. So this morning we are joined by a very distinguished panel. We have Ambassador Mull. He serves as the lead coordinator for Iran nuclear implementation at the Department of State. Prior to this appointment, Ambassador Mull served as the ambassador to Poland and as executive secretary of the State Department. Mr. Smith is the acting director of the Office of Foreign Assets Control at the Treasury Department. Prior to joining OFAC, Mr. Smith served as an expert at the United Nations Al-Qaeda and Taliban Sanctions Committee and as a trial attorney at the U.S. Department of Justice. Without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements will be made part of the record, and members here will have 5 calendar days to submit any statements or questions or extraneous material for the record. So if you would, Mr. Ambassador, please summarize your remarks. We'll go to you first.
With pleasure, Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, and all the distinguished members of this panel. I appreciate the opportunity to meet with you today to testify on the progress we've had on implementing the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA. This is a really important deal for America's security and that of our friends and allies around the world. And I welcome Congress's oversight and partnership in making sure we get this exactly right. On January 16th, the International Atomic Energy Agency issued a report verifying that Iran had completed its key nuclear steps under the JCPOA, thus reaching implementation date. Those commitments signified that Iran had dismantled 2/3 of its installed centrifuge capacity, including all of its most advanced centrifuge machines, and drastically rolled back its enrichment program, which had been growing exponentially over the past decade. It shipped out almost all, about 25,000 pounds worth, of its enriched uranium material. Going forward, Iran can possess no more than 300 kilograms of up to 3.67% enriched uranium for the next 15 years. Further, Iran removed the core of its Arak reactor and rendered it inoperable by filling it with concrete, cutting off the path by which Iran could have produced significant amounts of weapons-grade plutonium. Iran placed its nuclear program under an unprecedented and continuous IAEA verification and monitoring regime, using modern technologies like electronic seals and online enrichment monitors that can detect and report cheating. The IAEA also has oversight of Iran's entire nuclear fuel cycle, from uranium mills to enrichment facilities and centrifuge production plants, ensuring that Iran cannot divert nuclear materials to a potential covert program without detection. Furthermore, any goods and technology usable for nuclear purposes must now go through a procurement channel administered by the United Nations Security Council, creating yet another layer of transparency, oversight, and monitoring into Iran's nuclear program. Iran is now also provisionally applying, as a result of this agreement, the additional protocol to its Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement with the IAEA. This, along with the JCPOA special provisions to address disputes regarding IAEA access to an undeclared location within a short period of time, ensures that the IAEA will have all the access it needs to in an ongoing way verify Iran's commitments. As a result of these actions, in keeping with the deal, on January 16th, the United States, the European Union, and the United Nations Security Council lifted nuclear-related sanctions against Iran, allowing the resumption of some international commercial and investment activity with Iran. In keeping with our commitments, we will not try to block commercial activity that the JCPOA permits. However, we will be closely monitoring it to be ready to act with the substantial existing authorities that we still have as a government if that activity supports goals that are hostile to our interests in the realms of terrorism or in Iran's ballistic missile program. All U.S. sanctions on Iran that are not nuclear-related remain in effect. As evidenced just a few weeks ago, when we designated for sanctions a number of individuals and entities for supporting Iran's ballistic missile program, the JCPOA in no way limits our ability or will to use these tools to respond to Iran's other destabilizing activities. That's precisely why our allies and nations around the world support this deal. It eliminates the threat of a nuclear-armed Iran. It gives the international community unprecedented tools to ensure Iran's nuclear program remains exclusively peaceful going forward, and it does not limit our ability to respond to Iran's destabilizing policies and actions. In short, it makes the world safer for all of us. Just a few weeks ago, Israeli Defense Force Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Gadi Eisenkot acknowledged that the JCPOA reduces the immediate Iranian threat to Israel because it, quote, rolls back Iran's nuclear capability and deepens the monitoring capabilities of the international community into Tehran's activities. In those same remarks, Eisenkot also said that he believes that Iran will make great efforts to fulfill their side of the bargain. The JCPOA was not built on a prediction of what the future will bring. It's built on a solid verification regime, and my team and I will continue working every day to confirm that Iran is living up to its JCPOA commitments or face the consequences. The administration looks forward to continuing to engage with this committee and with the Congress in general on this important topic. I look forward to answering your questions today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Smith.
Good morning, Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to appear today before you to discuss our actions on Implementation Day of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA, and our efforts to enhance and enforce our Iran-related sanctions going forward. I'll be addressing the key steps that my office, the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, took to fulfill the U.S. government's sanctions-related commitments on Implementation Day. And I'll address the many Iran-related sanctions authorities that remain in place and how we approach our responsibilities to enforce those authorities. The JCPOA is a strong deal that protects the national security of the United States and our partners and allies overseas. And Implementation Day was a significant milestone of the JCPOA. In exchange for Iran verifiably completing its key nuclear-related commitments under the JCPOA, we lifted nuclear-related sanctions on Iran. We took our steps on Implementation Day only after the International Atomic Energy Agency verified that Iran had completed its key nuclear commitments under the JCPOA. The deal gives us the necessary flexibility to respond to Iran if it fails to comply with its JCPOA commitments, including the ability to fully snap back international and domestic sanctions. As the agency tasked with implementing and enforcing U.S. economic sanctions, we are clear-eyed about the fact that Iran remains a state sponsor of terrorism and continues to engage in other destabilizing activities. We believe it is crucial to continue to implement and enforce the sanctions that remain in place. On implementation day, the United States took action with respect to sanctions in two key areas. The first and most significant was to effectuate the lifting of nuclear-related secondary sanctions, which are sanctions that are directed toward non-U.S. persons for activity outside of U.S. jurisdiction. The second area concerns three relatively narrow exceptions to our primary embargo on Iran, which remains in place. On implementation day, OFAC issued a statement of licensing policy establishing a favorable licensing policy with respect to exports or re-exports to Iran of commercial passenger aircraft and related parts and services to be used exclusively for commercial passenger aviation. We also issued a general license authorizing the importation into the United States of Iranian origin carpets and foodstuffs. And we issued a general license authorizing U.S.-owned or controlled foreign entities to engage in activities involving Iran that are consistent with the JCPOA and applicable U.S. laws and regulations. To assist the public in understanding all the sanctions modifications effective on implementation day, OFAC also published on our website a summary of the actions we took, as well as hyperlinks to documents that explain in detail the contours of the sanctions lifting, including a guidance document that describes in detail the lifting of the nuclear-related sanctions and the sanctions that remain, a set of more than 85 frequently asked questions, and information on the changes that we made to the various sanctions lists. While we have fulfilled our implementation day commitments to lift the sanctions specified in the JCPOA, OFAC continues to administer a robust sanctions regime targeting Iran outside of the nuclear arena and the range of Iran's troubling activities. Broadly, the U.S. primary embargo on Iran remains in place. This means that U.S. persons generally remain prohibited from engaging in transactions or dealings with Iran or Iranian entities unless transactions are exempt from regulations or authorized by OFAC. In addition, secondary sanctions continue to attach to the more than 200 Iran-related individuals and entities on OFAC's specially designated nationals and block persons list, what we call our SDN list, as well as any such persons we add to the SDN list in the future. And Treasury remains fully committed to using our existing sanctions authorities to target Iran's support for terrorism, its human rights abuses, its ballistic missile program, and its destabilizing activities in the region. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Let me start, Mr. Smith, with the fact that you note in your testimony that there are still hefty secondary sanctions available for anyone who is connected to the IRGC or Iran's support for terrorism. Why then haven't we been able to do more on Mahan Air, which is the Iranian passenger airline that also happens to be the favorite with the country's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps? The IRGC uses this particular company to ferry its weapons and its personnel into Syria to aid the Syrian regime. And after Quds Force Commander Soleimani flew to Moscow to enlist Russian support for a counter-offensive to salvage the Syrian regime, these flights to Syria actually increased. And so last year, your colleague at Treasury testified that regardless of the deal, a foreign bank that conducts or facilitates a significant financial transaction with Iran's Mahan Air will risk losing its access to U.S. financial systems. So, instead of more action to ground these planes as part of the prisoner deal, the White House agreed to lift an Interpol red notice against Mahan's chief executive and a senior manager, whom the U.S. Treasury said was responsible for the airline's sanctions evasions operations. So if we're serious, we could take immediate action against those financial institutions that transact on this Iranian airline's behalf in Asia and Europe and the Gulf. We should slap heavy fines on European and Asian ground service companies working with the airlines. Are we going to do that?
Sir, we've been very engaged around the world on the question of Mahan Air. We have reminded our allies, our partners, and other third countries of the secondary sanctions that remain with respect to Mahan Air. We've continued to designate those entities that try to support Mahan Air around the world. We did some designations several months ago. We continue to look at those targets, and we continue to engage with governments around the world on the need to stop working with Mahan Air, and we are going after the finances where we can.
Yeah, but I've just got to point out, so unless those heavy fines, I mean, it's one thing to jawbone and to say this, but in the meantime, they are expanding their operations. And in the meantime, they are flying into Syria on a regular basis, and you see what's happening in Aleppo in terms of the encirclement of Aleppo. As that support comes in, it has very dire consequences in Syria. And what I don't see is the pushback. Let me give you another example. So what is the specific national security interest that justifies this claimed waiver? We know what happened. We passed legislation here that said you don't get an automatic visa waiver. You've got to go through the regular process so that we can check if you go to Syria or you go to Iran or you go to Sudan, because those are state sponsors of terrorism. By what logic does the administration then do a carve-out? What is this national security interest that justifies this waiver? Does the U.S. have a national security interest in supporting so-called legitimate business in Iran? This is the argument the administration makes. Legitimate business in Iran, the reality is, as your Treasury Department says, the Revolutionary Guard Corps is the most powerful economic actor. How does this justify going around the law that the President signed simply because the Iranians protested this?
Sir, I can say that with respect to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, secondary sanctions continue to attach. We continue to enforce those. With respect to the visa waiver program, I'd have to defer to my colleagues at the State Department.
Well, let me explain, Ambassador and Mr. Smith. What the administration should have told Iran is stop supporting terrorism and this won't be a problem. Because the way we wrote it, it is state sponsors of terrorism. But the problem we are having is that Iran has not changed its course. Iran is still supporting Hezbollah to the hilt, still saying they're going to transfer 100,000 GPS guidance systems to help missiles and rockets held by Hezbollah, provided by Iran, by the way, to better target cities inside Israel. But instead of doing that, instead of taking that stance, you created an exception. The administration created an exception. And again, the President signed the law. It sounds harsh, but it sure looks as if the Supreme Leader effectively vetoed the bill that had been passed and signed.
Mr. Chairman, the administration supported the law that the legislation as it came through the Congress to amend requirements for the visa waiver program as a means of tightening the security of our borders, which is something very important to the administration. That law, the Congress included in that law a waiver provision to allow waivers for those cases that affected the national security of the United States. As a government, in implementing that law, we have to develop what the criteria are for exercising what those waivers will be. And I can tell you that none of the criteria that we considered was how to promote greater business engagement with Iran. It was really aimed at making sure that those people who carry out important missions to our national security in Iran, whether it's the IAEA inspectors who need to get into Iran to verify that Iran is keeping its commitments, to allow journalists to go in and report.
That was not our objection. Our objection is that the administration turned the concept of a case-by-case waiver on its head. Under the law, the proper question is, why is it in the national security interests of the United States that this particular person be allowed to enter the United States without a visa? But you've boiled that down to, is this person involved in so-called legitimate business in Iran at a time when the IRGC controls all the major businesses in Iran? A broad category that was expressly discussed and then rejected during the legislative process. We had this debate. We had this debate with the administration. We reached our consensus. This bill was signed into law, and then the Iranians objected. They objected because they wanted more business with our IRGC and with these other entities controlled by the mullahs and controlled by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. I should go to Mr. Engel. My time has expired, but thank you very much, Ambassador and Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think what you're hearing is the frustration that while we seem to be, in many instances, talking tough about Iran, in reality, our actions are far away from our rhetoric, and that's a worrisome thing. We want to make sure that Iran's feet are held to the fire, and we don't want loopholes to allow Iran to wiggle out of the thing, wiggle out of their obligations. Let me ask Ambassador Mull, the administration said that on implementation day, Iran would receive around $50 billion, and a government spokesman in Iran claimed $100 billion was released. Do we know exactly how much was released and where the money is going?
Our estimate really throughout this process has been that Iran had slightly upwards of $100 billion in frozen assets in international financial institutions around the world. Of that amount, a significant portion of it, our understanding is more than $50 billion, is already tied up and committed to other debts, to trade deals that had stalled because of those frozen assets, and that, in fact, those assets freely available, of that slightly upwards of $100 billion, about $50 billion would be available. That has remained our assessment throughout.
Thank you. Mr. Smith, President Rouhani recently toured Europe, and in doing so, he is seeking to deepen economic ties, particularly, it seems to me, between Iran and Italy and Iran and France. He announced tens of billions of dollars in new economic ventures. Are we expecting that Europe will hold a hard line on the deal should Iran cheat, or I should say when Iran cheats? Do we expect Europe to enforce snapback sanctions if Iran cheats, when now it's becoming economically beneficial to have some of the European countries having these deals with Iran? How much can we count on them if and when Iran cheats? And I suspect that they will, that Europe will forego some of its ventures and slap economic sanctions on Iran.
Sir, I fully expect that Europe is going to continue to remain a committed partner with us and our sanctions programs. We have to remember that Europe had many of these trade deals before 2010, before 2012, and yet Europe has gone along with us. They've already sacrificed many of those deals the first time around and cut those deals off in compliance with the coordination that we've done and the secondary sanctions that we've implemented in cooperation with this Congress. So I fully expect that Europe will continue to comply with the deal that we've struck.
But the lifting of the arms embargo and the lifting of sanctions against Iran's ballistic missile program obviously could further destabilize the region. When the arms embargo expires, Iran will legally be able to ship weapons to Assad, to Hamas, to Hezbollah. International interdiction efforts will suffer greatly. And after 8 years, countries will be able to sell Iran components for its ballistic missile program. It's galling because during the entire negotiations, we were told that the only thing that was being negotiated was not ballistic missile programs, but just the nuclear question. And then suddenly we find this clause stuck in which allows frees Iran from being banned from purchasing ballistic missiles 8 years and others in 5 years. So how will U.S. sanctions work to address this issue after 5 years and after 8 years?
I think part of the reason that you saw the difference in what the UN would allow after 8 years was the way that we had all conceived of our sanctions. I think the UN had looked at those sanctions, and those sanctions were imposed at the UN, and we got the UN consensus because those were viewed as nuclear-related sanctions. So they were viewed at the UN level as part of the nuclear-related file. But I will tell you that the U.S. sanctions, our secondary sanctions, continue with respect to the ballistic missile program. We've got all of the major Iranian components related to the ballistic missile program on our SDN list. Secondary sanctions remain on those individuals and entities, which means that any European or third country or other actor that deals with Iran and deals with those entities with respect to the ballistic missile program, even after 8 years, will still have to contend with our secondary sanctions.
Okay. Let me ask you my final question. What has the response been from our allies in the Middle East since implementation day? That would include Israel and the Sunni Arab countries. What's the administration doing to reach out to Israel and our Gulf allies, those who are obviously more closely affected by the Iran deal, to raise their comfort level?
Thank you, Ranking Member Engel. In my current capacity, since taking on this responsibility in September, I've met several times with senior Israeli officials to hear their concerns. Secretary Kerry also maintains a regular dialogue not only with the Israeli leadership, but also with our Gulf allies on a regular basis to address their concerns. It's no secret that Israel was opposed to this deal. My impression since the deal came into force is that they want to work with us to make sure that it is implemented fully. That's a partnership and a relationship that I welcome. I intend to go to Israel in the next few weeks to continue that dialogue. Secretary Kerry most recently was in Riyadh to meet with his counterparts from the GCC states to hear their concerns. They've been supportive of the deal as well, but they also want us to remain focused on Iran's destabilizing activity in the region, and of course we will be.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ranking Member Engel. In the 1990s, previous CIA directors confirmed in congressional testimony that North Korea was selling missiles and technology to Iran. In 2013, former State Department official David Asher testified before our committee that a cooperation agreement signed in 2002 between North Korea and Iran was the keystone, his phrase, for the North Korea-designated nuclear reactor built by Iran proxy Syria, which was destroyed in 2007. And throughout the years, there have been a litany of reports confirming Iran-North Korea collaboration on nuclear and ballistic missile technology, as well as the presence of Iranian and North Korean scientists and technicians at the test of these weapons in their respective countries. The United States has repeatedly sanctioned North Korean and Iranian entities for their collaboration on these issues. Reports now indicate that Iranian scientists were again present for North Korea's nuclear test in January. So I have several questions related to that. Ambassador Mull, what U.S. entities are tasked with monitoring Iranian and North Korean collaboration on nuclear and ballistic missile issues? And if Iran acquires nuclear technical knowledge from North Korea, and just the expertise, the know-how, the results from nuclear tests, not actual nuclear-related materials, would Iran be in violation of the JCPOA or any other sanctions against itself or North Korea? And also, can you confirm if Iranian officials, scientists, or technicians were present in North Korea for its latest nuclear detonation on January 6th? And moving to another topic under the JCPOA's Annex 3, the civil nuclear cooperation, the U.S. and other P5+1 members are obligated to cooperate in helping Iran develop its civil nuclear program. Has the U.S. or any other P5+1 country begun any transfers to Iran as part of this annex? And what has been transferred? How do we reconcile some of these transfers with prohibitions under existing U.S. law? And lastly, the U.S. no longer seems to care as much about Iran's human rights atrocities and its support for terrorism worldwide, because the administration seems solely fixed on giving Iran a good report card on complying with the nuclear deal. If you could comment on that as well. Thank you, gentlemen.
Congresswoman, thank you very much for those very topical questions, which I'll be happy to address. You are right that through the years there have been connections with Iran, with many other parties, North Korea, but others as well, in developing the nuclear program that we have found to be such a grave threat against our interests, the interests of Israel and our other friends in the region. So that's the reason that we took on this deal, to limit the capacity for that program to pose a threat.
But which are the entities that are tasked with monitoring this? Which are the?
Yeah. So I can assure you there are few issues that get as much attention from the U.S. intelligence community, our diplomatic attention, our military attention, than the nuclear threats from Iran, North Korea, and elsewhere. We will remain very much engaged. In fact, I'd say even more engaged now that we have very specific criteria by which to judge Iran's compliance with this agreement.
Can you confirm whether Iranian officials were present in North Korea?
I cannot. I'll be happy to take that question back.
If they acquire, if Iran gets from North Korea not the actual materials, but a lot of the expertise, would that be a violation on the JCPOA?
The JCPOA spells out very specific, measurable commitments that Iran must meet: the number of centrifuges, the number of the amount of enriched material that it has, the extent of its reactor program.
If Iran gets know-how, advice, et cetera, results from tests, but not material itself, is that a violation?
North Korea is not specifically mentioned in the agreement, but however, in the agreement, Iran committed to refrain from all research aimed at developing a nuclear weapon. If we had reason to believe they were not complying with that, we have all the full range of opportunities to respond.
Just quickly, have we begun any transfers to Iran on this, the annex, the third annex, the civil nuclear cooperation?
That annex does not require civil nuclear cooperation. It allows as appropriate. The United States has not provided any material. However, we will be co-chairing a working group of the P5+1 that will review Iran's development of a new Arak reactor to make sure that it does not.
And Mr. Smith, just one note: you are not overlooking the human rights record. You're not overlooking their support for terrorism throughout the region, throughout the world.
No, ma'am. We continue to be very engaged in Iran's human rights abuses and its support for terrorism. We've already designated many of the principal actors in Iran, many of the principal entities that had engaged in human rights abuses, and we continue to follow the evidence.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. I want to touch on three different things. Thanks for being here. I want to talk about the $100 billion in frozen assets that are now available to Iran. I want to talk about the secondary sanctions, the U.S. secondary sanctions on ballistic missiles and sanctions under the deal. And third, I want to talk about non-nuclear sanctions and the 300 individuals and entities that were delisted on implementation day. So first, on the issue of the funds, Ambassador Mull, you explained that it's $100 billion, but $50 billion is tied up elsewhere, meaning $50 billion is available. Whatever the ultimate numbers are, what are we doing to actually track that money as it is released, since any of that money that flows into the hands of those who are supporting terrorists would then trigger terrorist sanctions or human rights sanctions?
In this setting, I can tell you that we monitor very closely, without going into too many details, where those assets go as they are released. As General Clapper testified earlier, a few days ago, so far it seems that most of those funds are going into infrastructure, domestic infrastructure projects, to the extent that they're able to monitor that. We have not seen a substantial change in levels of support for terrorist activity. However, we remain very closely focused on that, and through the sanctions that we have remaining, a very strong toolkit of sanctions, we remain ready to take exact appropriate penalties when required.
Good. And I hope that I appreciate that response, and I hope that we have an opportunity to continue to engage in this discussion in this setting and in a classified setting. Secondly, on the issue of ballistic missiles, Mr. Smith, you talked about U.S. secondary sanctions applying even after 8 years. I'm less concerned now about what happens after 8 years than I am about what's happened right now. And right now, Iran has violated the UN Security Council resolution by testing those ballistic missiles. We've imposed sanctions, and I commend the administration for doing so. But the JCPOA, the international component of the JCPOA, is founded upon a Security Council resolution. What, if anything, can we expect the Security Council to do in response to the clear violations of existing Security Council resolutions and the JCPOA that Iran is engaged in by testing these missiles?
So what I can tell you is that we still have most of the major economic actors in Iran that have engaged in ballistic missile testing, and any of the work on that, we still have them on our secondary sanctions list.
No, I understand.
In terms of
Security Council.
In terms of the Security Council activity, I'd probably defer more to my state colleague.
And that is, will the Security Council remain focused on
We took these tests to the Security Council, as I understand it. The Security Council looked at it, then it goes to the Sanctions Committee. Where does it stand now? How likely is it that we're actually going to see sanctions on what is a clear violation of the UN Security Council resolution? And if they don't sanction when there is a clear violation, what confidence can we have in their ability to carry out the terms of the JCPOA?
Well, the Security Council, of course, has a feature that was written into the founding treaty of the Security Council, where permanent members of the Security Council have a veto. So if any, we have raised in the days after this test our strong belief, Ambassador Power condemned this launch as a violation of UN Security Council 1929, which we believe. The Sanctions Committee agreed with that assessment. The Security Council has not yet won the full agreement of all 5 permanent members to take appropriate actions. But I'll tell you, Congressman, we don't counter the Iranian missile program just by relying on the Security Council. We have a broad range of tools that will
Ambassador,
continue to
I understand that, and I appreciate that, but it gets back to my main point here, which is under the terms of the JCPOA, we wrapped all of these Security Council resolutions into a new Security Council resolution that specifically includes the ballistic missile section, which has now been violated. And ultimately, we've been told throughout, including this morning, that our allies remain committed. which does, I guess the question is that just simply our closest allies? Is it no longer the P5+1? That's a concern, but I only have a little time left, and I'd just like to turn to my last issue, which is the companies the 300 individuals and entities that were delisted on an implementation day. We have been told repeatedly that that list is being scrubbed, and that if any one of those individuals or entities should be sanctioned for violating either the terrorism, either because they support terrorism or because they violate human rights, that they would be sanctioned. Where are we on the review? Have you identified any who should be, and when will those sanctions be applied?
Congressman, we actually, even before we reached implementation day, although we had agreed to remove 400 entities from the so-called SDN list because of their being put there for nuclear reasons on implementation day, while removing them for the nuclear reasons, we added 200 of those back onto our SDN list because of terrorism and other concerns. I can ask Mr. Smith to get into the details.
So what I can say is that when we took the 400 off, before we did that, we did the comprehensive review of all of them to make sure that we were comfortable with removing them, that we didn't see any support for terrorism, human rights abuses, ballistic missiles. We kept those entities on. Since that time, we have continued to follow the evidence. If there is evidence of any kind of activity that would violate our sanctions, that fall within the sanctions that remain, we will act against those actors.
I understand, Mr. Chairman. If I could I just want to clarify. So are you saying, because I didn't know this, you're saying that of the 400 individuals and entities who were listed in the agreement, 200 of them are still being sanctioned for terrorism and human rights violations?
No, I should clarify this. Is we removed 400 from the list because they were not related to terrorism, human rights abuses, ballistic missiles, or others. 200 of those were marked by the Treasury Department before as government of Iran or Iranian financial institution. We still, in the United States, our U.S. persons are still obligated to block and do no transactions with anyone that is identified as the government of Iran or Iranian financial institution. So those 200 that we put on a separate list, just a list for U.S. persons to say these are government of Iran or Iranian financial institutions, no terrorism, no human rights abuse.
Which I understand. I just want to know, where are you in scrubbing the list of other names, and when will you make a determination whether any of those other individuals or entities should be subject to sanctions for terrorism or human rights violations?
So the plan that we continue to have is that we review all of the intel and all of the evidence that comes in. We don't look at every name that's on we have 5,000 names on our SDN list. We don't look at every name. We look at all of the intel that comes in, and does that affect any name on our SDN list? Should we add a name to our SDN list? So we work with our IC partners and the rest of the U.S. government to make sure we collect all the information, and that if it's sanctionable conduct, whether or not you were removed from our list or you were never on our list, that's when we take action.
Has any action been taken?
We have taken action. We took action the day after implementation day against a number of ballistic missile supporters. We continue to work. We designated an al-Qaeda related yesterday. We're continuing to work across the range of our sanctions programs.
Time of the gentleman has expired, and Chair recognizes himself. Let me just, but my understanding is on the ballistic missile deal, they were relatively low-level people. Let me ask you with regards to a simple yes or no would be very helpful. The Iran Sanctions Act expires, as you know, on December 31st of this year. Will the administration support legislation simply extending the Iran Sanctions Act so that nuclear-related sanctions it provides can be snapped back if Iran cheats? I know there's been some talk already that talk of that is premature. I absolutely disagree. We need to set this, just a straight reauthorization. Are you for it? Secondly, in terms of enriched uranium, exactly what can 5,000, Ambassador Mull, this would be to you, of course, what can 5,060 centrifuge machines actually produce? Does it constitute any threat whatsoever? And if they build more machines, how can we be sure that that has or has not happened? You've testified that Iran shipped almost all of its estimated uranium stockpile out of the country, leaving behind no more than 300 kilograms over 15 years in Iran. Could you tell us exactly where has Iran enriched uranium been shipped? Who watches it? Who guards it? And is there any potential or any concern that it could be clandestinely returned to Iran? And of course, I've raised this with Secretary Kerry in the past. Are there concerns that North Korea could be providing such material to Iran in a clandestine way? And finally, on the human rights issue, and I am going to be chairing in my subcommittee another hearing on human rights issues in Iran. They are despicable. It's one of the worst violators of human rights in the entire world. The use of torture, the use of executions, there are very few parallels. North Korea comes to mind, and a few other countries. How many individuals have been designated? Has the top justice in Iran been designated? I yield for your answers.
I'll start with the last question on human rights abuses. We've continued to designate under the Human Rights Authority, but we designated all of the top actors in Iran almost from the beginning. And so if you go down the list on human rights, we've got the IRGC, we've got the Iranian Ministry of Intelligence and Security, we've got all of the law enforcement forces, the Iranian Cyber Police, the Center to Investigate Organized Crime, all of the major actors in Iran that would have any touch on the human rights abuses we've designated. The numbers are about 37 individuals and entities that have been designated because we went after all of the big actors.
How many in the past year?
None in the past year because we had already done the major actors.
And what is the
before that
consequence
time.
of such a designation in real terms?
The assets are frozen in the United States. U.S. persons are prevented from dealing with them, but it also carries the secondary sanctions. So we can tell third country entities, you deal with these individuals or entities. You
And
no
the
longer
response
have
of those third country entities, particularly Europe?
If Europe tries to deal with any of those that are designated for human rights abuses, I mean, I would say that Europe has many of those actors still remaining on its sanctions list, so we haven't seen that conduct, but we would go to anyone and say, you will be cut off from the United States if you continue to deal with those actors.
And you're ready to do that? Have you done that yet?
We haven't seen that activity from those organizations, and individuals are not the ones that anyone is trying to deal with at this time.
Ambassador Mull.
Sir, on your nuclear-related questions, the 5,060 centrifuges, IR-1 centrifuges that are permitted to operate, the operational part of the agreement isn't on what they produce. It's that Iran may not have more than 300 kilograms at any time in the next 15 years of no more than 3.67 relatively low-enriched uranium. If Iran exceeds that amount, it will face a response from the Joint Commission, which could feature being declared in violation of the agreement, and then appropriate snapback sanctions that could take, that would be one of the consequences. Secondly, if Iran builds or employs more than 5,060, they will also be subject to being declared in violation of the agreement. These enrichment facilities are under 24/7 monitoring by the IAEA with cameras, with regular visits, and we have a good handle on whether or not they will be keeping those commitments. In terms of other covert support, because there is full-time IAEA monitoring of the entire fuel cycle within Iran, it is impossible to introduce elements into that system without being detected by the system, by the IAEA. That applies to whether North Korea supplies material or anyone. The material that Iran shipped out, the 25,000 pounds of enriched nuclear material, Russia took that under its control. We obviously have many differences over many years with Russia, but one of the features of our relationship is pretty close cooperation on protection of nuclear material. We do not have concerns that material—
Do we have any on-site accountability? Can we go and verify ourselves? Or
We cannot.
We cannot. Who does?
Well, I mean, Russia has tons of nuclear material, has for many years. Russia is responsible for maintaining access
What
to
town
controls.
is it actually being, where's the repository for it?
I'm sorry?
Where has it been put?
It's not been fully, according to our information, it has not yet been decided where exactly Russia will
It's
put
been
this
shipped out, but it's
information.
gone somewhere. It's not on a
It will.
ship somewhere.
It's still in the process of being delivered in its entirety.
So it's not all shipped out yet.
It's all shipped out. It all left Iran
But where did
on
it
a
go?
ship.
I mean, it's got to be somewhere.
It's on a Russian ship in Russian custody under Russian control.
It's actually on a ship right now.
I believe if it has not arrived yet, it will very soon, and it will be kept within controlled Russian facilities.
But again, we're then trusting the Russians to say that they have it under their purview. They're watching it. I mean, they're so close to Iran. They have double-dealed us, and especially in the Middle East, the Syrians. I don't know why we would trust them. That it's. Could you tell us where it's going? I mean, that's important, and then I'll.
I mean, that's a Russian government responsibility to decide where it goes. We do not have concerns about Russian custody of this material. What's important in this deal is, will it go back to Iran? And I can guarantee there are sufficient controls in place that if one piece of dust of that material goes back into Iran,
But again, can the
gonna be aware of it.
IAEA go to that ship and verify that it's there and follow it as it goes to its final resting place?
IAEA has different monitoring arrangements with each country in the world.
I would not have confidence that, I mean, it's not even in a place, it's not even in the city that you're saying. It's not even in any, it's not somewhere in Russia that we can say, there it is. We don't even know where it is.
The IAEA verified the loading of all of this material onto the.
But loading and where does it end up is very important.
Again, that is the Russian government's responsibility to decide where it goes.
That is a flaw, in my opinion. And the yes or no on the Iran Sanctions Act?
On the Iran Sanctions Act, we remain ready to work with the committee to decide on its proper when and if it should be properly reauthorized.
Well, I think it's, our opinion would be, many of us, not everyone, is that if you want snapback sanctions and you want to continue the accountability regimen, you got to have the Iran Sanctions Act. I don't know why it's not a simple yes, because we're talking about straight reauthorization. Brad Sherman.
The entire country has been captivated by ISIS. The beheadings on YouTube revolt us all. But the Shiite extremist alliance based in Tehran is more dangerous and more evil. They have killed far more Americans, hundreds in the 1980s in Lebanon, hundreds in Iraq, and hundreds in Afghanistan from Iranian-provided IEDs. This alliance of Iran, Assad, Hezbollah, and the Houthi is wrapping up victories in the Middle East now. They're not just more evil because they've killed more Americans. They're responsible for the deaths of 200,000 Syrian civilians. The difference here is that Assad, supported by Iran and by the money that Iran now has available, when ISIS kills 50 people, they put it on YouTube. When Assad kills kills thousands, he has the good taste to deny it. Now, the nuclear deal was not supposed to be a get-out-of-jail-free card for everything that Iran does. We have Sections 301 and Sections 302 of the Iran Threat Reduction Act that I worked with our former and present chairman on. You've only designated 70 entities under 301, but just as important, under 302, you have not sanctioned a single business that I can identify for doing business with the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps, an entity that puts new blood on its hands every day in Syria. Mr. Smith, what's the most prominent or well-known company that has been sanctioned for doing business under Section 302 for doing business with the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps?
Sir, I'm sorry, I'd have to get you that information.
I've got the information, 0.0.
We've done a significant amount of IRGC designations. IRGC is one of the
designations are nice. What about sanctions?
Designations are sanctions, sir. Designations under this authority.
I'm talking about secondary sanctions.
So when we designate an IRGC, if you have the IRGC label on our website, then if we
okay, look,
designate
the
with that tag,
IRGC
that
isn't
carries
trying to do
secondary
business in the United States. The IRGC is getting its supplies from companies in Europe. Which European companies have you sanctioned for doing business with the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps?
When we designate an IRGC and we put an IRGC tag, that carries secondary sanctions.
Have you imposed a secondary sanction, Mr. Smith, or can you just, the filibustering is supposed to go over on the Senate side?
The answer is if they carry secondary sanctions.
Have you designated, have you imposed a secondary sanction on any business
Not
in
had
Europe.
to, because the European actors have moved away from that business.
And none of them are doing business with the IRGC.
I have not seen evidence of European actors continuing to deal with the IRGC.
Okay, what about South Asian and East Asian actors?
I haven't seen-
Nobody's doing, okay, because the Treasury Department has announced that the IRGC is this huge economic monolith. You've only designated 70. There are a lot more fronts for you to designate. But you say it's this huge economic, and yet you can't find a single East Asian, South Asian, or European company that's doing business with them. Let me move on to Air Mahan, another designated entity, the airline of choice for the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps and for thugs going to Syria to kill people. They're flying Airbus aircraft into friendly countries in the Middle East and Europe. Those Airbus aircraft have U.S. technology on it. What have we done to prevent those aircraft from being received in those friendly cities?
A number of agencies of the U.S. government, including Treasury, Commerce, State, and others, have been actively engaged to try to prevent Mahan Air from being able to fly.
Have we stopped anything, or are we just sending letters?
We have stopped.
Where have we stopped Mahan?
I don't think I can say in this setting. But
Can
I
you get that
provide
to
the
me
information.
confidentially? We haven't, let's break this. They're flying into an awful lot of European and Asian and Middle East friendly cities. Why haven't we nailed a single bank for doing business with Mahan? No secondary sanctions on any bank.
We continue to try. We continue to do what we can to follow the
But
evidence.
we can't find a single bank that's doing business with Mahan?
If we find the evidence, then we will go after them.
Okay, but you have found zero evidence of any. I mean, we're relying on the executive branch to enforce this deal because you're able to monitor what Iran does. And here's an example where you've got a major airline doing business in dozens of cities, and you can't find them doing business with a single bank.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
back.
Mr. Rohrbacher?
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to associate myself with the concerns about human rights that Congressman Smith outlined, and I would like to say that there are ways of approaching the human rights issue that will have an impact for today. There are other ways of approaching it that will have a major impact for the future as well. Let me just say that we have with us today folks in their yellow jackets who remind us they're here as testimony to the fact that we have a brutal human rights abusing regime in Tehran. They're here to remind us that they have families, and there are still people, whether it's in Camp Liberty or whether it's in Iran itself, who are being held and being tortured and being repressed by this mullah government that has, they think they have the destiny of, they have the, how do you say, the blessings of God for these horrible crimes that they're committing against their own people and have been doing so for decades now. If we are to have a nuclear-free Iran, and what we're really trying to do is trying to stop this. We recognize now the Shiite-Sunni split, and the last thing we want to see is a nuclear exchange between Sunni Muslims and Shiite Muslims. This is really almost it's not just for our own national security, it's almost a humanitarian effort on our part to try to prevent that weapon system to become part of that historic fight between these two factions of Islam. But let me just note that just the sanctions for human rights abuses is not enough, and I don't believe we're doing it with the gusto or with the determination that we need to, although you know more about that than I do, or what the potential use of this is. But that's one part of the human rights approach. The other approach is that we need to be supporting those people. We're not just not just punishing those people who are oppressing the population, but supporting those people in the population who want to bring about a more democratic Iran and want to basically sever the mullahs from their iron grip that they have on Iranian society. Have we done anything based on the fact that now we've had this rapprochement on the nuclear issue with the Iranian regime? Have we in any way stepped up direct support for any group within Iran that is trying to make a more democratic country?
Congressman, thanks for the question. I'm afraid I'll have to take that back for you. In my responsibilities day to day, my job is focused exclusively on making sure Iran meets all of its commitments, that it doesn't get to have a nuclear weapons capability. We remain gravely concerned about the human rights situation in Iran. I think there's probably not another country in the world who speaks up more often about our concern and takes action through the international community, through international organizations, as well as through our own laws and authorities.
I understand that you folks wouldn't know if we had operations going on this part of the human rights issue. I mean, challenging those people who are violating human rights and versus helping those people like the MEK and others who are trying to overthrow this mullah dictatorship, and which would create a better situation for achieving all of our goals if we had a more democratic government there. Let me just say that is, if we do not do that, if we do not help those people who are struggling to build a more democratic Iran, we're just postponing the time when Iran and the mullahs will have a nuclear weapon. Because our treaty that we're talking about, how many years is it before it no longer applies? Is it a 15-year thing? So instead of postponing, we don't need to postpone that time. We've already postponed it long enough. We need to eliminate that eventuality by making sure that we're supporting the democratic elements like the MEK and others, and the Baluch and the Azaris and others, the Kurds in Iran who want to live a more free society. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rohrabacher. Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. You know, this is a fascinating hearing because it's supposed to be on the implementation of the Iran nuclear deal. And some of the most strident and loud critics of entering into that deal at all are now focused on airlines and Revolutionary Guard business activities and sanctions and closing down banks, and rather than the actual elements of the nuclear agreement, which they were the first to say would never work. They would cheat. The metrics weren't good enough. This was enabling nuclear development by Iran. So, Ambassador Mull, I'm going to ask some questions about the nuclear agreement and its compliance. So, any evidence of Iran cheating so far?
So far, no. I can tell you, Congressman, that in the 6 months or so I've been working on this in the run-up to implementation day, whenever we've detected that there might be a potential for moving away from the commitments, we've engaged with our Iranian counterparts, and they've addressed those concerns every single time.
Every single time. Okay, we're going to have to run through this real quickly because I want to try to understand. Let me see. One of the requirements of the agreement was to modify the Iraq heavy water research reactor so that it could no longer produce weapons-grade plutonium. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And did they do that?
Yes.
What did they do to do that?
They removed the core of the reactor and filled it with concrete so it could
Is that reversible?
not very easily, no.
Is it observable?
Yes, it was observed.
So they complied.
Yes,
Pretty big deal.
yes.
All right. They had 19,000 estimated centrifuges, and they were required under the agreement to get down to 6104. Is that correct?
That's right, sir.
Did they do that?
Yes, sir, they did.
They did?
Yes.
And was that observable?
It was verified by the IAEA.
Oh, my Lord. All right. They had full enrichment at Natanz and Fordow. What's the status there?
Natanz, enrichment at Natanz is proceeding as allowed by the agreement. All enrichment operations at Fordow have been observably ceased.
And what was the enrichment level before the agreement?
The highest amount that they enriched to was 19.75%.
19 points. And is that weapons grade?
No.
But they're required to go down to 3.67, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So from 19 to less than 4.
Yes.
Did they do that?
Yes, sir.
Was that observable?
Yes, it was.
Can they quickly go back to 20 or 19?
Only by breaking elements of the agreement, and they would have to do so in places that are under full-time observation of the IAEA.
Now, did I understand you to say that their stockpile of enriched uranium was in excess of 25,000 kilograms?
25,000 pounds.
25,000 pounds. And the agreement says they can have no more than 300 kilograms. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
From 25,000 pounds to 300 kilograms. Did they do that?
Yes, sir.
You're kidding.
No.
They complied again?
Yes.
And was that observable?
It was observed and documented by the IAEA.
Now, they also had to agree that centrifuge production in uranium mines and mills would be subject to IAEA or international inspection at any time. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Have they complied with that?
Yes, sir.
So all those predictions of the end of the world, Armageddon, the fact is we're just enabling a nuclear development. It sounds to me, Ambassador Mull, that at least so far, we're not dealing with a perfect state. We're not dealing with perfect behavior. There are lots of other things we object to vehemently. But with respect to this agreement, so far, they have in fact abided by it, not cheated, that we know of. We've got a pretty vigorous inspection regime. We have metrics that have met. And it sounds to me like, despite predictions to the contrary notwithstanding, they're further away from a nuclear weapon today than they were before the agreement. Is that correct? Would that be a fair assessment from your point of view?
That is undeniably true.
Well, my Lord. So we can, we can decide we want to pillory the administration in one of the most important nuclear agreements, in my opinion, in our lifetime. I happen to draw the opposite conclusion of the Prime Minister of Israel. The existential threat to Israel would have been denying this agreement. It's hard work to make an agreement. It's hard work to make it implemented. It's hard work to validate it. It's hard work to stick with it and oversee it. But so far it's working, and thank God it is.
And it's hard work to say that's enough. Mr. Connolly, and now we turn to Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I really appreciate the extraordinary efforts of Chairman Ed Royce, his leadership to expose the increasing threats to American families by, I believe, the Iran deal. Additionally, I'm really grateful. This is a bipartisan concern. We've heard it from Ranking Member Engel, Mr. Deutsch, Congressman Sherman, and Ambassador Smith, Mull, and Mr. Smith. I believe your testimony today confirms American families are at greater risk than ever, that the terrorists are better financed than ever to achieve their goal of death to America and death to Israel. And in fact, Mr. Smith, you admitted that Iran is a state sponsor of terrorism. How could you not recognize that by releasing $100 billion to a state sponsor of terrorism, that a significant amount of that money would be used to kill American families?
Sir, I think we thought that a state sponsor of terrorism with a nuclear weapon was a far dangerous threat to the international community, its neighbors, and to the United States. What I can say is that we put through the efforts of our sanctions, Iran is in a $500 billion hole, and what we've released allows Iran to have about $50 billion, much of which it needs to stabilize its currency and to have any foreign trade whatsoever.
But American families are at risk. In fact, last month in Baghdad, it was Iranian-backed terrorists that kidnapped 4 Americans. And so they're not stopping. And that may be kidnapping today. I had still not forgotten 283 U.S. Marines killed in Beirut by the Iranian regime. We should not forget that. I had 2 sons serve in Iraq. Every day they were at risk of IEDs provided by Iran. Dismissing this is incredible and putting the American people at risk. And Ambassador Mull, you indicate that Israel now supports the agreement. This is in direct contradiction to every bit of information that we've received from the Israelis themselves. And so, yes or no, does Israel support this or not?
Congressman, as I said in my testimony, the Chief of Staff of the Israeli Armed Forces has publicly said that the threat to Israel of a nuclear Iran has declined as a result of this agreement. Does that mean that the entire Israeli government is happy with it? No, it's obviously they've had serious concerns about it. But at the same time,
again, yes or no, but it's, hey, in a democracy, you'll have, thank God Israel is a democracy, you'll have good people agree and disagree. And back again to the development of the intercontinental ballistic missiles, Ambassador, there was virtually no response. As Iran continues to do that, there's only one purpose for the ICBMs, as indicated by Congressman Engel, Congressman Deutsch, and that is to develop a capability of nuclear weapons to strike America. Is there any other reason for ICBMs?
Well, that's one of the reasons that we undertook to rid Iran of the ability to attach nuclear payloads to those missiles. ICBM missiles can be used without nuclear payloads. That's why they're still a threat to us and our allies, and why we're working hard against them.
But hey, the real use of an ICBM is to use with a nuclear capability, not to make some type of conventional attack. The American people are truly at risk, and for this to simultaneously occur is extraordinary to me, and there not be repercussions. And so over and over again, we see the American people at risk. And then when you identify the IAEA inspections, is it not true there's not an American on the inspection team?
There are a number of Americans who work in the IAEA,
but not on the
safeguard
team.
staff. Americans do not travel to Iran. That's
no.
correct.
And what you've really described, and American people need to know this, no Americans, no Canadians. What you're really describing is self-verification by the Iranians of their own existence. And so I really am saddened by what I hear today. And to me, it just confirms what Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, the former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, said, in quote, that the Middle East policy is one of willful ignorance. And it's willful ignorance that I think is putting the American families at risk. And I hope you'll change course. There's been over and over again requests for what's been done to enforce sanctions or to reinstate sanctions. I'm really grateful to be working on legislation with Congressman Joe Kennedy. It's bipartisan, about zero tolerance for violations. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. I thank Ranking Member Engel for, at the beginning of this hearing, reminding us that this agreement has been approved, and now we have the responsibility to be certain that it's being implemented properly and we prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power. And I think when you think about it, as you said, Ambassador Mull, what the consequences would have been in our efforts to push back on Iran in a number of ways in the region because of their aggression and ongoing activity, it would be a very different scenario if we were required to push back on Iran with nuclear capability and make, I think, a difficult situation even more dangerous. So I have three very specific questions. When the United States began negotiating with Iran, the breakout time was a few weeks to a few months, according to most experts, that point by which they would have enough enriched uranium to build a nuclear weapon. How far is Iran from breakout now as a result of this implementation?
Sir, over the course of the last 3 months, Iran has moved from breakout time of about 2 months to at least 1 year.
Okay. The International Atomic Energy Agency is being asked to do some significant work in terms of compliance with this agreement, and I actually wrote to the President about this, urging that we be certain that we provide additional resources to the IAEA to do this work. I know the administration's proposal provides a modest increase, but I think the IAEA has already indicated that it's not sufficient. Would you speak to the importance of making certain that we, in a bipartisan way, allocate sufficient resources, recognizing we don't fund the entire operation, but that we meet the financial requests of IAEA so they can do the work that we're asking them or requiring them to do?
Yes, sir. I am in regular contact with Director General of the IAEA, Yukio Amano, to affirm that he has sufficient resources for his agency to do a very important job that's vital to our national security interests. And he has assured me that in terms of its responsibilities for the nuclear program, it is fully funded and has everything it needs for the rest of this year. Obviously, we will continue, and we very much welcome the Congress's bipartisan support for making sure that the IAEA is fully funded.
Yeah, and I think the request they made for fiscal year 2017 is an increase of $10.6 million. So I don't think that's reflected in the administration request, but I think many of us are very concerned and want to be certain that they have the resources that they need. And finally, I know there's been a lot of discussion about the snapback provisions and non-compliance by Iran. For obviously the behavior of this country and its leaders give us lots of reason to expect there will be some non-compliance. And what I'm interested in knowing is what work the administration has done to deal with violations of this agreement. While some people have argued if there's even the slightest unintentional violation, the deal's off. That would obviously result in the deal which will prevent Iran from being a nuclear power from being abandoned, which doesn't give us a result we want, to allow Iran to pursue its nuclear ambition. So there has to have been some conversation about what is the administration's position about minor violations of the agreement. Have we developed a grid of what those consequences were? Have we communicated those to our European allies? I know there's some discussion of zero tolerance. If there's anything, the deal is completely abandoned. I'd just like to know your thoughts on that, what the administration is considering, and how we should think about sending a very clear message to the Iranians that any violation of this comes with a punishment and a consequence, even if it doesn't ultimately mean rejecting the entire deal.
Yes, sir. I can tell you that the JCPOA allows quite a broad range of potential responses to violations or contradictions to the agreement that range from a partial reimposition of sanctions to full imposition of not only bilateral sanctions, but those from the European Union and the UN Security Council. I'm not sure that it would be helpful for me to speculate here in terms of what each individual violation or contradiction to the agreement would provoke, because we think that uncertainty of response is something that's a diplomatic asset to us as we go forward. But I can tell you that, generally speaking, the gold standard for us in deciding how to respond is the breakout time that we talked about a few moments ago. That if Iran's breakout time diminishes below a year, we would consider that to be a very serious violation and work with our allies to have the appropriate response.
And of course, communicating to the Iranians that it is the position of the United States that any violation will be addressed and punished in an appropriate way.
Yeah, yes,
there's
sir.
no, death by a thousand small cuts.
Yes, sir, and I can assure you we are in daily contact with IAEA on their evaluation of the situation in terms of Iran's compliance.
Thank you,
you.
Mr.
I yield back,
Cicilline.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Duncan is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First off, let me say that I hope history is right and sides with Mr. Connolly's comments more than history did with Neville Chamberlain's comments. And we'll see. I hope that Iran continues to comply. I hope that they don't have a nuclear weapon, because the consequences are dire. I want to talk about the visa waiver program law that was passed as part of the omnibus in 2015, December, as it relates to the JCPOA. And I specifically want to point to negotiations that went on from November 30th through the passage of the omnibus. These were negotiations between the White House, State Department, Homeland Security, and members of the House and Senate. On November 30th, DHS asked for certain waivers for people to travel to Iran and Iraq in the March 2011 forward time frame. And the negotiations went on for quite some time on December the 1st, December the 1st, December the 2nd, December the 3rd. An agreement's finally reached. And December the 3rd, the White House notifies the Homeland Security Committee via email that they support the negotiated text that does not allow visa waivers for specific groups or categories. Okay? That's December 3rd. December 3rd at 10:37 in the morning, White House notifies CHS, Committee on Homeland Security, staff that the State Department has no further edits to that text. Okay? President signed H.R. 2029 into law, which included the visa waiver program language. December the 19th, Secretary Kerry sends a letter to the Iranian foreign minister stating that the U.S. will implement the requirements of this law so as not to interfere with the legitimate business interest of Iran. You ought to be talking about the legitimate business interest and the national security interest of the nation of the United States of America. But that's what he said. Then on January the 21st, the Homeland Security announced implementation plan for the visa waiver program enhancements with 5 broad categories of waivers, including category exemptions that were rejected, specifically rejected during the negotiations by Congress through December the 2nd. Are you familiar, sir, Ambassador, with the visa waiver recommendation paper memo, white paper issued by the State Department?
I've seen many papers that were involved in a discussion of deciding what the administration's policy would be in implementing case-by-case waivers.
I'll remind the committee and you that during the negotiations, the Congress and the administration, including the State Department, said they agreed with the text and the negotiated text through the passage of the omnibus. And then shortly thereafter, they issued this white paper, which talks about, it actually references a second white paper called a legal paper within this document. I have no idea what that is, and we don't have our hands on that yet. But in this paper, it specifically comes up with rationale for circumventing the will of Congress, as well outlined during the negotiations, during the omnibus and during the visa waiver program law, signed by the President. Before the ink's even dry on that bill, they're issuing a white paper on how to circumvent that with rationale. I think it points to actually negotiating in bad faith in December before the omnibus if the State Department feels like they're going to go around the will of Congress, to go around these negotiations and actually allow the issue of waivers, visa waivers, for people that have traveled to Iran from the European countries. To the simple point that part of it says, this is one of the questions they're going to ask, Madam Chairman, for someone traveling on business purposes. Simple question. Was your travel to Iraq, and this was the Iraq portion, but I think it applies to Iran as well, after March 1st, 2011, question mark. If yes, was the travel exclusively for business purposes? That's a pretty benign question to be asking. I mean, there's not a lot of opportunity for delving into what the business was related to, who they were talking with, and going back to Mr. Sherman's comments as the the conversation with Mr. Smith went on a minute ago about contact with IRG. We're talking about European businesses, not American businesses, the European businesses and businessmen and women that are traveling to Iran who may have contact with Iran Revolutionary Guard, Quds Force, whoever, possibly come back to their home country in Europe and apply for travel to the United States under the visa waiver program. And according to the State Department, they're going to be given a waiver. That goes against the will of Congress, sir. We're going to delve into this more, Madam Chairman. I wanted to say, Mr. Chairman, I wanted to say all this on the record, and I would ask that this document be submitted for the record for my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to delve into this a little further. And with that, I yield back.
Without objection. We go now to Lois Frankel from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ranking Member, for this hearing, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here. I have two I think they're sort of related questions. First has to do with the snapping back the sanctions. We have read about a lot of economic activity now with Iran, with other countries. So my first question is, realistically, let's say we'll look 2 years ahead from now or 3 years ahead from now, and we had to do a snapback. What is the prospect of actually getting back to where we were before we lifted the sanctions? That's the first question. Second question I have is that, you know, we hear talk of people, and not to get political, but there've been presidential candidates who have said, well, if I get elected, I'm going to immediately rip up the deal. And I would like to know what you think the implications of that would be. Those are my two questions. Thank you.
I can do that. Thank you very much, Congresswoman. In terms of snapback, if we get to a situation in which Iran is not complying with the agreement and we decide to snap back those sanctions, reimposing the secondary sanctions, as my colleague Mr. Smith mentioned earlier, we've been down this road before where our European or other partners have an economic relationship with Iran. Companies from those countries do. But for whatever reason, we've decided to penalize and to force those countries and companies to make a choice. Either you do business with Iran or you do business with us. Every single time they choose to do business with us because it's a more profitable relationship. So I have no doubt that if we decided to snap back sanctions, that we would be effective in achieving that. In terms of various interests that some candidates have said that they might rip up the deal on the first day in office of a new presidency, I would only say that I would advise whoever the new president and his or her team would be upon taking office to think very carefully about destroying a deal if Iran has continued to comply, which has reduced its breakout time, extended it from one or 2 months to over a year, to one that has drastically shrunk the amount of enriched nuclear material that could move to a bomb. I'm not sure I see what the benefit to U.S. interests would be in freeing Iran from those commitments that have made our interests much safer.
Mr. Smith, did you want to answer?
I would just agree with what Ambassador Mull said with respect to sanction snapback. The world knows what we can do with our secondary sanctions, and I think they will follow. We're all very trained in what the secondary sanctions can accomplish, and they know the force of U.S. law in this area.
But I guess would it be safe, though, to, I don't know if the word safe is correct, but I would assume that even if you put the sanctions back in place immediately, you're still not going to, it's still going to take a while for Iran to actually feel the same impact that they felt before they went to the table.
It may take some time before Iran feels sanctions if they come back on, but we should remember where we are today. Iran is in a $500 billion hole because of the sanctions that we've imposed over the course of time. Now they're facing a drop in oil prices just as the sanctions relief is coming into play. What we're talking about is them getting about $50 billion, much of which they need desperately to prop up their currency and to be able to do any foreign trade. So when you look at the $50 billion that's relieved that they're getting versus the $500 billion hole they have, I think it's going to be a very long time before Iran gets out from under the sanctions burden that we've imposed.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
We go now to Mr. Perry of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. I will tell you that I appreciated the very direct questioning of Mr. Connolly and the very direct answers on very specific items. But I would also tell you that in my view, Iran has played long ball, and we have been myopic. And while this, I think it's a bit early to talk about cheating on some of the specifics, but I do think in time that they will get there. But I just see them as consolidating their gains in Syria and Yemen and Iraq, and then using their ballistic technology, completing that testing and that program over a series of years to the point where when they are ready to be nuclear, there'll be very little that we can do with it, and that's the long ball, and that's the long goal. I see Iran as the regional hegemon. But within that context, let me ask you, Ambassador, a question here. The procurement channel in the United Nations Security Council 2231 allows for nuclear articles and dual-use articles to be provided to Iran from foreign suppliers through a dedicated procurement channel. However, some of the materials on dual-use lists that can be supplied through the dedicated procurement channel are critical to Iran's ballistic missile programs such as carbon fiber. I know you're aware. So this is a simple yes or no question. Would Iran's acquisition of carbon fiber outside of the dedicated procurement channel, so in here described, be a violation of the agreement and or the UN Security Council resolution?
Congressman Perry, I'm sorry, I can't give a yes or no answer because each case would be dependent on what exactly the intended use of any such material through that channel would be. The United States has a veto in the procurement channel, and so anytime that we believe that an item is going to improve Iran's ballistic missile program or is going to be delivered in a way that's not subject to appropriate end-use monitoring, I can't imagine the circumstances in which the United States would agree to a case like that.
Let me make sure I understand your answer. You said it would be episodic, right? It depends on the because of the dual-use proposition. But then you kind of said, I think, that the United States understanding and recognizing that wouldn't be amenable to their procurement of that. Did I characterize that correctly or not?
Well, again, we would examine what is the good that they're seeking to procure, what's the stated purpose of its use, will it be monitored in a way that we're satisfied that it won't be used in a way to harm our interests across whatever.
I mean, you know that they can't domestically produce carbon fiber, right?
As of now,
right.
yes.
So and you know it's critical for their ballistic missile program, I'm sure. And it's regulated through the procurement channel. So how would it not be monitored if it's regulated through the procurement? How would its use not be monitored?
Well, according to the terms of implementation of the procurement channel, any country that wants to sell any material that's subject to controls of the procurement channel, as part of their applying for permission to proceed with the transaction, they must explain how they're planning to monitor the end use. I'd also add that we have a number of other tools outside of the procurement channel, such as the missile technology control regime, that we will continue to work.
I don't mean to interrupt, but I've got a limited amount of time. So Rouhani has already stated that it's their intention to expand their ballistic missile program and that they will have to gain access to carbon fiber elsewhere, and it will not go through the procurement channel. Are you familiar with that he said that?
I'm familiar in broad terms with what he said about how he plans to develop the missile program, yes.
So if or when they do buy outside the procurement channel, which then there is no, because it's outside, you don't know what they're using it for, and there's no inspection paradigm or verification paradigm associated with that, would the administration consider that a violation of the agreement and the Security Council resolution?
So, Congressman, I mean, what is subject to the control of the procurement channel is a very specific list of nuclear supplier group annexes of potential dual-use material and other sensitive controlled nuclear related items,
including carbon fiber.
Well, it depends. I mean, it depends on what exactly.
What does it depend on?
What it would be.
They're going to go outside the procurement channel, as stated by Rouhani.
Sir, I can assure you that we will use every technique and every tool at our disposal, whether
including
it's the
considering it a
or
violation, including considering it a violation. Yes or no?
Well, a violation would be if Iran procures something on the nuclear suppliers group list of annexes outside of the procurement channel,
including carbon fiber. So the answer would be yes. With your indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Carbon fiber.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it, Ambassador. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. We now go to Mr. Alan Lowenthal of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ambassador Mull and Mr. Smith, for being so forthright in answering questions. I want to follow up on some of the questions that Mr. Connolly has addressed, and I think this is really to you, Ambassador Mull. And you've already, I think, described to us about the removal of the core of the plutonium reactor. You've already described to us about the shutting down of the thousands of centrifuges, its shipping out of the country of its highly enriched uranium. in exchange for lower-level nuclear fuel for its nuclear power plants. I want to follow up on these questions. And I'm curious about the extraction of that highly enriched uranium stockpile. If you can tell us how that was done, it was sent out of the country, where it was taken, what steps we are taking to ensure that it's a permanent transfer, and that the Iranian regime will not be able to get its hands on that or other highly enriched uranium in the future.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Congressman Lowenthal. Iran agreed that it would remove virtually all of its enriched nuclear material. To keep that obligation, what it decided to do was to negotiate with Russia the transfer of that material out of Iran on a Russian ship into Russian custody without any claim of title to that information. So it has surrendered this material to Russia. Russia has committed to responsibly safeguard it within the size, within its entire nuclear program that it has there, a long history, obviously, of maintaining and safeguarding nuclear materials.
Are we able to know, or is there some way that we can follow up on that, or will we be monitoring and where both the Russians and the Iranians are, so that that enriched plutonium never returns back to Iran?
Yes, sir. I mean, we've worked with the IAEA and through this agreement to make sure that any possible entry point of nuclear material like that back into Iran could only take place under the observation and monitoring of the IAEA. So if there were some development by which someone tried to do that, we would be aware of it, and we would consider that a violation.
And approximately how much was delivered to Russia?
About 25,000 pounds of enriched uranium material.
And what could 25,000 pounds of enriched uranium do? How much would it take of that to develop nuclear weapons?
Well, none of that material, the highest grade of enrichment of that material that was removed was at 19.75%. Nuclear weapons material, weapons grade uranium really has to be at the 90% level or higher, highly enriched uranium.
I want to follow up. You know, a lot of us voted, and I was proud to support the agreement. But we had concerns about the implementation, so that's why we're so glad that the two of you are here today. And we're concerned, as some of these questions have been raised, about Iran's other non-nuclear troublemaking, the security of Israel and the region. These are all concerns. Congress wants to stay abreast of the compliance and any violations. You know, in a letter in August to my colleagues from New York, to New York Congressmember Mr. Nadler, the President allayed many of these concerns, and he detailed his plan, which included committing a highly qualified senior official with ambassador rank to monitor them. That's really your position now that's come up. What I'm interested in is, in your role, do you have all the proper access and information that you're going to need? Are there any things that you're going to need to regularly report? And how often can we expect those kinds of interactions with you to follow up on this?
Yes, sir. I am at your disposal and at the disposal of any member of Congress to come down here at any time and answer any questions or concerns that you have. I feel extraordinarily well supported by the entire administration. I have regular, rich, frequent interactions with various representatives of our intelligence community. I have access regularly to Secretary Kerry, other senior officials in the White House who are very much focused on the implementation of this deal. So I feel very well supported, and I am, and my team and I are ready to.
So you understand this is just the first. We've just begun this process, and that you will be very much agreeable to be coming back to the committee, to reporting on a regular, because I think it's critically important that we stay in touch.
Yeah, no, absolutely, sir. I think this is a vitally important part of my job, because you may raise questions that I haven't thought of, and this is about the interests of all of our countries. So I very much want to be a good partner for the Congress.
Well, I will be calling upon you.
Thank
you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal. Now we go to Mr. Mark Meadows of North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Smith, let me come to you with regards, you're talking about this $1 trillion hole that the sanctions have had great effect. So let me just maybe narrow our focus a bit as it relates to Hezbollah and the financing of Hezbollah. I guess I know that you implemented some new sanctions in January. The announcement was sanctions. But my question, I guess, goes really to the heart of the matter, and it is with regards to Iran. And are they financing Hezbollah, in your professional opinion?
I think we've seen Iran support Hezbollah over time, yes.
Are they today?
I haven't seen the latest figures.
Well, within
but
the
I
last
would,
6 months, wouldn't you have had
we have
intel
seen
that would
Iran
suggest that?
continue to support Hezbollah.
All right. So at what point would you consider putting sanctions on Iran, whether it's through the executive order that is in place or through the new law that the president just signed into law in December? At what point will you consider putting sanctions on Iran for supporting Hezbollah?
So Iran is already under a government blocking from here, meaning that we
I'm talking about
freeze all
central
their
bank.
assets.
Listen, I understand it.
Sure.
I'm talking about the additional tools that you have. At what point will you implement additional sanctions as it relates to Hezbollah and the financing that comes from Iran?
I think I'll have to look at the evidence in the future and see where it takes us. That's what we do. We follow the evidence, and when we see evidence, we continue to develop targets to add them to our list.
But your testimony is that the last intelligence you had was that they are financing Hezbollah. Let's be intellectually honest. I think we both know that they are. Is it not true that the greatest benefactor of Iran's support, or the greatest benefactor for Hezbollah, is Iran?
That's a statistic that I'm not sure that I have. I don't want to go beyond what I
Can you
think
get
I
it
know.
to this committee and to the chairman?
I think we could get that to you in perhaps another setting, a classified setting.
All right. So then, under your professional opinion, who might be a greater financer of Hezbollah other than perhaps their illegal drug activities? What other state sponsor could be greater than Iran?
Sir, I've already acknowledged that I think that Iran has continued to do so. I don't want to go beyond my
The
expertise.
American people see pictures of sailors on an anniversary today, and they're offended. I'm offended. And if we have tools in place that can address it, and you're not using them, would you not believe that that is being irresponsible?
Sir, we're continuing to use our tools. We're continuing to designate virtually every month, every week. We're adding additional designations of terrorists. We did so yesterday. I think we'll continue to do so in the very near future.
But the big black hole here, Mr. Smith, is Iran. We're going all around it. We've got over 100 individuals, and I agree with you. I've been following the numbers. We're addressing it, but somehow Iran's getting a free pass, and that's concerning to the American people.
I would disagree with you about Iran getting a free pass. There are a number of agencies of the government of Iran that continue to be designated by the United States for their support to terrorism, a number of significant individuals that continue to be designated of the government of Iran for their support to terrorism, and those carry secondary sanctions consequences.
Ambassador Mull, let me come to you and follow up on a question that actually came up yesterday. Some of your colleagues behind you were there in the hearing at OGR as it related to the visa waiver program. Mr. Duncan of South Carolina mentioned that. Under what, since you're responsible for making sure that this JCPOA stays in place, was there language in there that would allow Iran to actually participate in our visa waiver program, either directly or indirectly? Because they're participating indirectly now. Was there language in there that would suggest that they should enjoy those benefits?
Language in the, I'm sorry, in the legislation or in the?
Well, we know there was in our legislation.
Not in the legislation.
I'm talking about in the joint agreement. Because Secretary Kerry came out and very quickly said that we're going to expand it to business-related activities, which was not in.
Yes. So, Congressman, thank you very much for the opportunity. I'd like to address, I think this is a critical misunderstanding that I really welcome the opportunity to clarify. The JCPOA, in that agreement, all of the parties agreed that they would not attempt to block legitimate business activity in Iran. When this legislation was passed, the Iranians immediately complained to me, to Secretary Kerry, accusing us of violating the JCPOA through this legislation. That's decidedly not the case. We explained to them that this legislation was not aimed at disrupting Iran's business activity. It was aimed at protecting America's borders. And it was in that context that Secretary Kerry, in fact, defended the legislation in responding to this untrue charge that the Iranians had leveled.
I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, we're going to go to Mr. William Keating of Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today and frankly, for your direct answers to questions. This is one area I just have left, because we've covered so much ground as a committee here this morning. And those are the issues for violations outside the JCPOA that we were told during the whole process will be vigorously pursued. We talked about some of the areas this morning where that would be relevant, including sport of terrorism, regional destabilization, human rights abuses, and ballistic missile programs, and we do know that Iran tested a precision guided ballistic missile capable of delivering a nuclear warhead in violation of UN agreements. We are aware that the U.S. sanctioned 11 individuals and entities responsible for supporting these kind of activities. Now, my question is this, in terms of your oversight, in terms of our ability as a committee to work with you in communicating and monitoring this. And I know you can't be very specific on this because it will hurt your leverage with sanctions in the future. But in these sanctions outside the JCPOA, could you just shed a little light on how you work administratively with other agencies of our government? Can you just shed some light on the process where you're determining what to give for sanctions at a certain level, what factors are going to result in your reviewing that and changing those sanctions, maybe escalating them, whether it's continued violations, whether it's a continuing, how do you arrive at that? How do you function administratively in reviewing those, setting those, so that we have a better sense going forward on these very important sanctions that are outside the agreement?
Thank you, sir. I think that's a very important question. I'm happy to try to shed some light on it. As I sit here today, we have teams of analysts at the Treasury Department who are pouring through the intelligence and other information that we have from a variety of sources, the intelligence community, from the Defense Department, from all of the agencies of the U.S. government. They look at the classified and unclassified information that's available, and they focus on the different sanctions programs that we have. So I have a team that's working on terrorism, Hezbollah sanctions, ISIL sanctions, everything in the terrorism realm, whether it's Iran-related or non-Iran related, we follow the intel. We also have teams working on our Syria sanctions, including any support to Syria, as well as anything dealing with Yemen, destabilizing activities in the region, and also teams that focus on the ballistic missile program. We gather the evidence to see if we see anything that fits within the sanctions program, and then if we do, we start to develop a case on it. We talk to the rest of the interagencies so everybody's on board so they know what we're doing. We don't want to, for example, interrupt a sensitive intelligence operation. We don't want to interfere with a law enforcement operation. So we make sure that what we do, we communicate very well so that when we roll out, we're able to roll out in the smartest, most effective way. So basically, we start from scratch, developing the intel, building cases, working with the team so that we can roll out successive sanctions against the greatest threats to our national security and foreign policy.
Yeah. And in that process, what triggers reevaluating things without getting into detail, because I don't want to undercut the leverage you have, but I mean, what are the things that are important that you're looking at when you say, you know, they're not reacting to these sanctions, we're going to have to leverage this up? What kind of things are you looking at?
I think we continue to look at our experience across all of our sanctions programs. We have a good idea of what's impactful, and that's why when we wanted to have an impact on Iran and many of these other sanctions programs, for ballistic missiles, we hit their major entities that do the ballistic missile program, SHIG and SPIG and Madafal, and all of the big names in Iran that are associated with the ballistic missile program. We hit those, and then we go after anyone outside of Iran that we see supporting that program. So that's why in last month, we went after a UAE and China-based network that we saw that was supporting that program. So again, we follow the evidence to see what's going to have an impact. And the evidence sometimes will suggest different impacts for different programs. And so we try to get the networks that are most critical to those bad activities.
So it's a dynamic situation. It's not something that's incremental. Here we go, we're going to impose this. Now, let's see. It's continually being evaluated. Is that correct?
Those under sanctions know how to try to circumvent them, and so we have to continue to evolve.
Well, thank you. That'll help us as we go forward, because this committee is certainly going to be concerned on these other violations going forward and how the U.S. reacts, and this will help give us our ability to perform the oversight function more properly. So thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Keating. We go to Ted Yoho of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I appreciate you being here. In your opinion, I think we already know the question or answer to this. Hezbollah, we could assume they're a terrorist organization that carries out proxy work for Iran, agreed?
Yes.
With Iran offering to put GPS technology on 100,000 missiles, would we assume that's for peaceful purposes or terrorist purposes?
I'll just say Iran's development of its ballistic missile program is something that remains under sanction by the U.S. government, and we continue to go after it.
Okay, good. So if they're supporting Hezbollah and giving this kind of technology to over 100,000 missiles, we can assume that's probably not for good reasons, right? I mean,
I'm going to continue to follow the evidence and
well, the evidence points that it's going there, and you know, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's a duck. This is not a good thing. And that brings me to the opening remarks of the chairman. President Obama, in the Rose Garden, pledged to remain vigilant and respond to Iran's continued sponsorship of terrorism, its supports for proxies who destabilize the Middle East, and threats against American friends and allies. Iran's destabilizing activity has continued in the wake of the nuclear deal. Is that not breaching the JCPOA?
Sir, the JCPOA is exclusively focused on Iran's nuclear program.
I want to take you to Measure 28 of the JCPOA, which clearly states that Iran and the E3 EU plus 3 will commit to implementing the JCPOA in good faith. If they're doing terrorist activity, is that in good faith?
Terrorism is outside the scope of the JCPOA.
What about the development of the ballistic missiles and the firing of those? Are they outside of that?
Yes, sir.
What about breaching UN Security Resolutions 1929 or 2231? Are they outside of the JCPOA agreement?
Yes, sir. We deal with those problems in other avenues.
All right. But also, in good faith, that's a part of the JCPOA. In good faith and constructive atmosphere based on mutual respect and refrain from any action inconsistent with the letter, spirit, and intent of the JCPOA that would undermine its successful implementation. I mean, we can argue which side of arming Hezbollah with 100,000 GPS-guided missiles or firing medium-range ballistic missiles as they did on November 22nd, I think it was, or November 20th, and then again on October 10th, which was before the agreement went into place. The point I want to bring out here is pretty clear. The intention of Iran is not to play, abide by the JCPOA with what they're doing. They're taunting. And for the administration to release sanctions, I've got a letter here that we wrote that has over 100 U.S. representatives that asked the President to hold off on sanctions. This was sent December 17th of 2015 by over 100 members of this body, Republicans and Democrats, that asked the President to look into this before we move further, and there was no response from the President. And I think this is a travesty to our negotiating, and I think it's weakened us. As we negotiate, I would only hope that our government, as we negotiate, is from a position of strength that makes our country stronger. Do you feel that this has made our country stronger, this negotiation, and what we've seen the actions of Iran do with the firing of these missiles, the firing of the missiles real close to our Navy destroyer, the way they apprehended our military personnel, and they make fun of them on a world scene? I mean, do you think that's made our country stronger?
No, that activity was outrageous. I'm disgusted.
Okay,
American
all right,
service
so it's not
military-
made our country stronger. Do you think the Iran nuclear deal has made Iran stronger?
I believe it has constrained Iran's ability to develop a nuclear weapon and has made us safer.
What about freeing up their money? You know, Mr. Smith, you were talking about the $50 million or the half a trillion dollars are in debt. If a country's a half a trillion dollars in debt and they're screaming for economic release and relief, would you think a country that is in that dire straits and suffering that bad would be funding terrorist activities?
Iran had continued to fund terrorist activities during the course of the sanctions programs.
So how bad were they suffering? You know, I heard that through the JCPOA agreement, and I didn't buy it. I didn't buy it then, and I don't buy it now. And I hope what Mr. Duncan said does not come to fruition. It'll either be a Neville Chamberlain moment, or we can look back and say, you know what, that was a Ronald Reagan moment. And I hope it goes the right way. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yoho. We now go to Grace Ming of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Ambassador Mull and Mr. Smith for being here and all your hard work. Since the JCPOA went into effect, Iran's hardliners have taken pains to consolidate their economic and political power and to sideline would-be reformists who are more amenable to a rapprochement with the West. It was hoped that the openings created by the JCPOA would engender Iranian moderation, but instead extremists have reaped the benefits while tightening their grip and escalating their malign behavior. Does the U.S. have a strategy to combat the retrenchment we see on the part of Khomeini, his allies, and the IRGC? And I'll just go through all my questions in the interest of time. How has Iran's terrorist activities been affected by the JCPOA? I know that you mentioned that it was outside the scope of the deal, but what do we know about if their support for terrorism has increased or decreased? Does the U.S. have an estimate of the amount of funding that Iran provides to groups like Hezbollah? How are the funds being transferred? And if we see an Iranian bank transfer funds for the benefit of groups like Hezbollah, will the U.S. immediately sanction that bank? And if we are to go beyond sanctions, is the administration pursuing any actions beyond sanctions to confront any of Iran's problematic behavior in the region? And if so, what are these actions?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. In terms of the impact of the JCPOA in the internal Iranian political situation, you are right. Many people have expressed various views and hopes and aspirations of the impact it would have. But the principal reason for the administration to pursue this has really been to diminish Iran's ability to build a nuclear weapon. And in that, so far, we've succeeded demonstrably by increasing Iran's breakout time to at least a year. It wouldn't be appropriate for me to speculate. We're not really implementing this deal to have a political impact on Iran. It's all about protecting us from a nuclear Iran. And as I said, in that we're succeeding. In terms of penalizing Iran's destabilizing activity in the region, we have a rich set of tools that we can use. And we've, as Mr. Smith has been describing, and I'll let him address in more detail, we've shown a readiness to do that. We've penalized, most recently on January 17th, Iran's ballistic missile program. In the past few weeks, we've continued to sanction Hezbollah activities and people linked to Hezbollah, and we will continue to do that. Mr. Smith.
I just add and say, Congresswoman, I don't have the exact amount that Iran uses to fund terrorism, we can go back and see. I think the intelligence community probably has the best number, working with the Treasury Department, but that would be more of a classified figure that we'd have to provide in a different setting. In terms of sanctioning Iranian banks for bad behavior in support of terrorism, we've done it. We've sanctioned Bank Saadarat in the past for its support for terrorism. We'll continue to follow the evidence of support for terrorism, ballistic missile support, destabilizing activities, and we will develop packages and targets when we see the evidence show.
Okay. And finally, but can we tell if the support for terrorist activities and groups have increased or decreased? I know the amounts.
Yeah. Again, Congressman, I think Mr. Smith is right that I think we'd be happy to go into more detail in a different setting. But I do note that General Clapper recently testified in the past few days that he has not seen an appreciable change in Iranian level of support since the implementation of this deal.
Okay.
The support for terrorism.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman Grace Ming. Ambassador, Ranking Member Engel and I both mentioned Iran's horrible behavior in the neighborhood, and that includes Iranian-backed forces that threaten those at Camp Ashraf. The committee raised this with Ambassador McGurk yesterday, and I passed these concerns on to you. These individuals need protection. The U.S. government needs to guarantee that protection. We have seen what has happened of late in terms of the loss of human life there at the camp. So I would convey to you what I conveyed to him yesterday, to the ambassador yesterday, which is this needs to be a priority. We appreciate the time of both of you as the witnesses here today before the committee. You've heard the deep concerns that many of our members have about Iran policy and how it's being carried out. So I know that you'll want to continue to be in touch with members of this committee as we move forward. And at this time, we'll adjourn the hearing. Thank you again for your appearance.